thousands of new wonders and hidden secrets. It's all about witnessing the paths you have never stepped before and knowing that the story of the making of a legacy. Introducing the key personality of the day, Dr. Rohan Pethiyagoda, a biodiversity expert, the naturalist who conferred the Linnean Medal for Zoology 2022 by the Linnean Society of London. He is the first ever Sri Lankan to receive this prestigious medal. Dr. Pethiyagoda is an author, educator, taxonomist and leading researcher on conservation of freshwater fish diversity in Sri Lanka and once served as the Deputy Chair of the IUCN Species Survival Commission. He has contributed greatly in highlighting the very history of biodiversity in Asia, linking together scientists, artists, travelers and explorers in both East and West. His impact on biodiversity research in Sri Lanka and beyond through his output and catalytic influence is truly a significant one. It's time to begin the story of insight. Take a moment. Come, walk with us into the forest's blessed abode to see the wondrous beauty the earth has bestowed through the eyes of naturalists.
Good evening, everyone. Nature is where all our roots of life are embedded, allowing the living to survive and prosper. There are only a few dedicated souls in this world who are true naturalists that always try to take a step forward in protecting Mother Nature while feeling its beauty. This evening, we are ready to inspire all of you with one of the greatest naturalists in Sri Lanka. This personality is a foremost biodiversity expert and naturalist and the first Sri Lankan who conferred the Linnean Medal for Zoology, making a legacy in 2022. He is none other than Dr. Rohan Pethiyagoda. Hence, we at BEES, the official club affiliated with the Department of Zoology and Environment Sciences, are ready to unfold the story of the making of a legacy in collaboration with BOTSOC, the official club affiliated with the Department of Plant Sciences, and the FOSS, the official media unit of Faculty of Science. First and foremost, to welcome all of you to this event, I cordially invite the President of BEES, Ms. Vihanga Amarakon. Over to you, Ms. Vihanga.
Good afternoon, all of you. It's a privilege to voice myself in a legendary moment life story to an audience full of welcome, Dr. Rohan Pethiyagoda, our guest speaker today. Sir, it's a huge privilege to have you with us, and we highly appreciate you accepting our invitation amidst your busy schedule. Next, Professor Devaka Weerakoon from the Department of Zoology of Colombo. Sir, it's a great pleasure to witness a session moderated by you, and we highly appreciate your cooperation in organizing this event. It is my greatest pleasure to welcome the Dean of the Faculty of Science of University of Colombo, Senior Professor Uppu Sonnadara. Sir, you have always been very supportive in the events organized by our student societies, and your presence today is of huge importance to us. I would like to gratefully welcome the head of the Department of Zoology and Environment Sciences, Senior Professor Preeti Udagama, and the head of the Department of Plant Sciences, Dr. Hashendra Katriarachchi, to this event, and we always admire the guidance you offer to us. I would like to extend a warm welcome to the Senior Treasurer of BEES, Professor Inoka Pereira, Senior Treasurer of BOTSOC, Dr. Anushka Wickramasuriya, and the Advisor for FOSS Media, Dr. Hiran Jayavira. Also, my heartiest welcome goes to all the academic staff members from all the departments and the faculties of University of Colombo. Your participation is of huge respect to us. I should remind of the hard underlying work of the executive committee members of the 3 clubs who are collaboratively organizing this event, the Bees, the BOTSOC, and FOSS Media. Thank you all too for this gracious moment. And finally, all the students from University of Colombo and other universities, and all the nature enthusiasts joining with us today. It's a great pleasure to have you all here with us. I hope you all will have a pleasant time with a lot of great ideas and insights to be added to your life to upgrade the nature enthusiast and the curious explorer within you. Cheers for another moment.
Thank you, Ms. Vihanga. Without further ado, let's move on to the most awaited portion of this event, the discussion with our guest speaker, Dr. Rohan Pethiyagoda. But before we start, let me share some kind reminders with our audience. Since there are lots of multilingual participants who have joined via Zoom and live FB, the webinar will be conducted in the English language. Due to the high number of participants, it's difficult to allow all of you to ask questions by unmuting yourselves, so that if you do have any questions to ask Dr. Rohan Pethiyagoda, please direct them via the chat box to the person who has renamed as questions. And the participants who have joined via live FB can direct your questions from the comment section. They'll be directed to Dr. Pethiyagoda during the Q&A session. To moderate today's discussion, we have Senior Lecturer Professor Devaka Weerakoon from the Department of Zoology and Environment Sciences, who is also a very good friend of Dr. Rohan Pethiyagoda. Professor Devaka Weerakoon graduated from the University of Colombo in 1985 with a major in zoology. He joined the Department of Zoology, University of Colombo, as a probationary lecturer in 1986. He received a Fulbright scholarship in 1988 to study in the USA, where he completed his MSc and PhD at Illinois State University. In 1995, he returned to the University of Colombo, and currently he's a professor at the Department of Zoology and Environment Sciences at the University of Colombo. So now I cordially invite Professor Devaka to introduce our guest speaker and to begin the most awaited discussion with Dr. Pethiyagoda. The floor is open to you, sir.
Thank you, Ayeshma. It is indeed a great honor and pleasure to introduce an old friend that I've known for a long, long time, Dr. Rohan Pethiyagoda. He was born in Colombo and educated at St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia. And after he finished his secondary education, he moved on to King's College, where he got his bachelor's degree in electrical and electronics engineering. And he went on to get an MPhil degree in biomedical engineering from University of Sussex. Having completed his postgraduate work, Rohan returned to Sri Lanka, and he was appointed as an engineer in the Division of Biomedical Engineering at the Ministry of Health, where he went on to become the director subsequently. Rohan has held many national and international posts, which includes Chairman of Sri Lanka's Water Resources Board, Chairman of Sri Lanka's Tea Board, and Deputy Chair of IUCN Species Survival Commission, Deputy Chair of the Assurance Group of the British American Tobacco Biodiversity Partnership, Board of Trustees of the International Trust for Zoological Nomenclature, and currently is a research associate of the Australian Museum, Sydney, and he's also a senior policy advisor to the Minister Member of Parliament Sajid Premadasa at the moment. Rohan Pethiyagoda, I think we know him better as a naturalist, and he came into the limelight in 1990 when he published the book Freshwater Fishes of Sri Lanka. That is how I also got to know Rohan. Before I actually met him, I read his work and I was quite impressed. I think Rohan is a pioneer and an innovator, uh, and he is also have instigated uh, research interest. After, if you look at the research on fauna, you see most of the work earlier has been done by foreign nationals. Then came the Sri Lankans like P.P. Dharaniyagala, PhD De Silva, C.H. Fernando, Professor Savitri and Nimal Gunatilaka, which has enriched our knowledge about Sri Lankan fauna and flora. And Rohan comes into the limelight in 1990 with the publication of his book, Freshwater Fishes of Sri Lanka. After that, he has set the Wildlife Heritage Trust, through which he has published many books, and he has also provided a platform for other people to publish books on fauna of Sri Lanka. Uh, and this is why I think he's an innovator, because when he published the freshwater fishes of Sri Lanka, it was done in a quite a different way than the previous editions on Sri Lankan taxa. It's used a lot of colorful photographs, distribution maps, and very descriptive records of species. And also, I think with that book, he also started another new trend, that is discovery of new species. In his freshwater fishes, he describes 2 new species, but later on, he published another paper which indicated that the amphibian fauna of Sri Lanka is much more than what we believed it was at that point of time. This led to a spate of discoveries, which led to a description of more than 100 new species of vertebrates and 43 species of freshwater crabs, all of which have been efforts of WHT led by Rohan. And Rohan's influence transcends beyond Sri Lanka's border, because his work on amphibians have triggered a similar interest in India, where people like Dr. Bichu has done a great deal of work on Indian amphibians. So I think Rohan's influence uh, has affected the entire Western Ghats region. That is why I think he's a pioneer and an innovator and instigator of research, because he has created a very new trend um, in Sri Lanka. And also he has been the editor of Loris, which transformed the old Loris into a new format, which I think is another masterpiece of Rohan. So Rohan has published numerous publications, including books, and his work has been uh, appreciated by the number of awards he has received. He has received the Rolex Awards for Enterprise and the prestigious Linnean Medal from the Linnean Society. He's the only Sri Lankan to receive this award. And he's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences, Sri Lanka. In honor of his work, many species have been named after him: fishes, frogs, lizards, spiders, dragonflies, and he even has an entire genus named after him, Rohan Salus. So Rohan not only did all this by himself, he has also helped a number of new researchers to come up, like Kalim Manamendra Arachi, Madhava Meghas Kumura, and the names go on and on. So this is why I think Rohan has made a very important contribution to the knowledge dissemination on fauna of Sri Lanka. And people like Rohan are somebody that we really need at this hour, because we all know we are going through some hard times. I have lived through a lot of hard times, but I think the current situation is perhaps the worst I have seen during my lifetime. And in times like this, we need hope. And Rohan is a beacon of hope, especially for aspiring young zoologists. Uh, he can maybe inspire them to see beyond the difficulties we are seeing today in our nation and try to rise up to the current challenges we are facing. So with that introduction, let me formally welcome Rohan. Welcome, Rohan, to the Department of Zoology and Environment Science and Bees. Thank you for accepting our invitation. It's always a pleasure to be with you. I think you are muted, Rohan.
හරි නේද ඇහෙනවද දැන්?
Oh, hey.
Right. So thank you very much, Devaka. Very kind of you. I think I should first make it clear a few corrections from the kind words you said about me. First of all, I am Mr. Rohan Pethiyagoda, not Dr. Rohan Pethiyagoda. Every time I start a lecture, I have to make this clarification because I'm introduced sometimes even as professor. ඉතින් ඒ ප්‍රතිරූපය තිබුණට මේ තාම Mr. මම. I just look like a professor. I can't help that. So that is one thing. The second thing I wanted to say is it might be a little difficult for me, but I suggest we conduct this discussion in English and Sinhala as seems appropriate, so that we can reach the maximum number of our colleagues who are listening in today, if that's all right by you.
It's fine with me. I was told that it was a little difficult for you to respond in Sinhala, so we'll try and do this bilingually.
But you know that I like making a fool of myself, so we can have some fun.
Yes, I'm sure there's going to be a load of fun. So let us start from the beginning, Rohan. Let us, as children, we all had aspirations to be somebody. I, of course, wanted to be a seafarer, but I ended up being an academic. No complaints there. What was your childhood like? Tell us a little bit about your times at St. Thomas's College, your aspirations as a child. What did you want to be?
So I feel a bit embarrassed to talk about my childhood because I had a privileged childhood, to be honest. My father was a tea planter, and for most of his life he was in around Thalawakale and Lindula, very nice climate to live in. And we used to spend our school holidays in that environment. He was a fisherman, and those days nobody went to Horton Plains. He was one of the few people who went and fished there regularly, so I'd go with him on some occasions. So I don't see my childhood, when I compare my childhood with those of the students with whom I deal with nowadays, I feel embarrassed about my childhood. That's the honest truth. But I want to look at another aspect of childhood, which I think is relevant, and especially since we are dealing today mostly with university students, I want to just say something about that aspect of my childhood, which I think many people don't think about. If we think about it, at the time we are born, we have no awareness of the world. Like අපේ පරිසරය ගැන කිසිම අවබෝධයක් නැහැ. අපි උපත ලැබුවම අපි දන්නේ නැහැ මේ අපි අවට මොකද්ද තියෙන්නේ කියලා. මෙතන බිත්තියක්, අතන රූපයක්, ඒ රූපේ තීන්ත ගාලා තියෙනවා, මෙතන ජනලයක්, ඒ ජනලයෙන් ආලෝකය ලැබෙනවා. අපි ඒ වගේ හිමීට අපේ පරිසරය ගැන අවබෝධයක් ලබා ගන්නවා. හැබැයි අපේ අවබෝධය ලබා ගන්නේ අපට යම් kutuhalayak තියෙන හින්දා, a certain curiosity that we have from childhood, we have about our world. හැබැයි අපි මේක ඉගෙන ගන්නවත් එක්කම, ඒ කියන්නේ අපි වැඩෙනවත් එක්කම, as we grow older, that curiosity gets dampened. ඒ කුතුහලය මර්ධනය වෙනවා. ඒක ඉබේම වෙන දෙයක්. So as we come into adults, we think we know everything about our surroundings, and we cease to be curious, or we are less curious about what's going on around us. ඉතින් අපි දරුවෝ හැටියට අපේ පරිසරය, අපි අවට තියෙන දේ ගැන අපි ඉක්මනට ඒ තොරතුරු ටික අවශෝෂණය කරගන්නවා. හැබැයි අපි වැඩිමහල්ලු ඇටියට පත් වෙනකොට ඒක ඉක්මනටම නැතුව යනවා. දැන් මම හිතනවා මං දරුවෙක් හැටියට හිටපු කාලේ ඒක ටිකක් මට ඒ ප්‍රශ්නේ අඩු වුණා. ඒ කියන්නේ මට මේක මම වෙන විදිහකට කියනවා නම් රිචඩ් ඩෝකින්ස් නැමැති විද්‍යාඥයා මේකට කිව්වා the anesthesia of familiarity කියලා. ඒ කියන්නේ හුරු පුරුදු කමේ නිර්වින්දනය. නිර්වින්දනය anesthetic එකක් හැටියට අපිට මේක වැටෙනවායි කියලා. We become anesthetized to our familiar surroundings. අපි ඒ ගැන ප්‍රශ්න කරන්නේ අපි like our curiosity is lost. ඉතින් මං හිතන්නේ මට ඒක උනේ නැහැ බොහෝ දුරට. මං තාමත් මං අවුරුදු දැන් 67ට කිට්ටුයි. මං තාම අර පොඩි ළමයෙක් වගේ හාරනවා. මට මේ පරිශ්‍රණය කියන්නේ මගේ ලේවල තියෙන මගේ ඇඟේ තියෙන දෙයක්. ඉතින් ඒක එකක්. So childhood was for me about curiosity. The second thing was a negative thing, Devaka, which is that I was not, and still am not, this is a weakness, a sociable person. මං සමාජශීලී පුද්ගලයෙක් නෙවෙයි. එදත් එහෙමයි අදත් එහෙමයි. ඉතින් ඒ හින්දා මට යාළුවෝ මිතුරෝ හිටියේ 14යි. අදත් මගේ සගයෝ ඇරෙන්න මගේ මාත් එක්ක පරිශන කරන ශිෂ්‍යයන් ඇරෙන්න මට සිටින මිත්‍ර සංඛ්‍යාව ඉතාමත්ම සීමිතයි. ඉතින් ඒක දුර්වලකමක්. හැබැයි ඒක මට ප්‍රයෝජනයක් වුණා. ඒ කියන්නේ මට තනියම ඉන්න තනියම වැඩ කරන්න පුරුදුයි කැමතියි. මම හිතනවා දවසෙන් පැය 12ක් විතර මේ කාමරය ඇතුළේ මං ඉන්නේ. මගේ බිරිඳ ඇරෙන්න මේ කාමරේට කවුරුත් ඇතුල් වෙන්නෙත් නැහැ. ඉතින් මට පුරුදුයි මෙතන මෙහෙම ඉඳලා වැඩ කරන්න. අපි සතියකට පාරක් විතර කවුරු හරි මුණ ගැහෙනවා නැත්නම් මම මේ තනියම මගේ බිරිඳයි මායි අපේ ජීවිතය ගත කරන්නේ. So I think out of that loneliness of working on my own, which is a weakness, I was able to be more productive. And so my childhood also was similarly a fairly lonely childhood. I mean, I'm not an antisocial person, but I don't like crowded places and so on. So that's I'm trying to tell you a bit of the good and a bit of the bad things.
Sounds very interesting. But what made you choose electrical and electronics for your graduate work?
So I had a problem that my father didn't really believe in the university system because he felt that like I could be a tea planter, for example, and live a life like that. But I had a friend who was going to be an electrical engineer and whose parents were going to fund him to go to England. And this was in the 1970s when when many people didn't go overseas for studies. But my mother's sister lived in England and she agreed to fund me. And because my friend was going to be an electrical engineer and his parents are the ones who convinced my parents to let me go, I decided to do the same course as he was doing. So it was not a good decision. But of course, I succeeded in being that. I think if I would have been as happy to work in biology, except that jobs in biology were hard to come by. I think they're still hard for most people graduating from zoology, even with a special degree these days. To find a job is tough. It's a lot of dedication. And so I know the challenge that students are going through when they graduate in the sciences in general, whether as a physicist, a biologist, or a mathematician, to find a rewarding career is difficult. So I faced the same challenge. And I became an engineer, and after my postgraduate degree, when I came back to Sri Lanka, I found that I was the only biomedical engineer in Sri Lanka. This was in 1981. And so for me to get a job was very easy, and for me to get promoted in that job was very easy. So by the time I was 25, I was already a director level in the government service, director of medical engineering for the Ministry of Health, in charge of a whole department and a staff of about 150 people as a little kid, basically at 25. So it was a huge opportunity for me. And I really enjoyed working in government. So that's another point I must make about my career, is that about half my career has been spent in government service in many separate blocks, and about half in the private sector, because I'm also a businessman. That's how I make a living. As a partner in a medical engineering company. I used to be, now I'm no longer, I'm retired. And that's what paid for all the research and the work we were able to do, because if I didn't work as a businessman, I wouldn't have been able to find the money, or would have found it hard to find the money from grants and so on to get on with the research. It would have been additionally difficult because I don't have a qualification in biology, Devaka. Though people treat me as a biologist now, I don't even have O-level biology. I had to learn everything myself because my subjects were physics and double maths and chemistry for A-levels. So it was a tough thing to transform, mutate into a biologist.
That's what made you a good biologist, because you didn't carry any additional baggage like we had to.
Yes.
Through 12 years of school education. But what made you change from engineering to start working on fish? What was your fascination about fish?
I had always maintained an aquarium since I was given charge of my first aquarium when I was about 7, with 2 angelfish, 2 snakeskin gouramis, and 2 goldfish. I still remember that. This was in 1961, I think. And I loved maintaining this aquarium. And as the years went on, my parents built another aquarium for me on the estate on which my father was working. And then I used to go around the local streams and catch fish and bring them for my aquarium. So I remember catching, for example, swordtails from Castlereagh Reservoir. It was full of swordtails, and belantia. The belantia were eating the baby swordtails. And in our local river, like these little loaches, schistura and devarios and so on, and keep them in my aquarium. I had no idea what these fish were called at that time. And one of them was discovered to be a new species by somebody else eventually, and described as Devario monticola. But I think Devario monticola, or fish very much like it, was one of the fish I had in my aquarium at that time. So to get into fish became a kind of thing with me, especially because I came into contact with Rodney Junkress when I was chairman of the Water Resources Board. And he was a great inspiration to me. And Rodney was a famous diver and outdoors person, and also another wonderful man called Cedric Martinstein. So Rodney and Cedric were professional divers. They dived catching aquarium fish for some of their time. And so they taught me the ropes of how to collect fish underwater. So usually freshwater fish until then had largely been sampled by people netting them, but they taught me for the first time to snorkel and learn how to catch fish by targeting an individual fish and then discover it. So in the process of doing this, we discovered a lot of interesting things. But then Rodney died before my book was published, he died. And so that left me to pursue my work on my own until Callum joined me, I think in 1993 or thereabouts.
And since then you have been responsible in, at least I wouldn't call it training, but you have shown the way to a large group of young people. Some of them are very successful professors today. How do you feel about that contribution?
I loved working with them, and I missed that. And now that I'm at a certain age, now that I'm like my children, many of the students now are younger than my children, so it makes it a very special bond for me. In some of these cases, I just can't differentiate between the young people I meet and work with today, or help or collaborate with, and my own kids. I think of them the same way, which means I worry when they say we are going on a field trip, for example. I'm like a fretful parent. I'm asking, have you taken your warm clothes, and all this kind of nonsense. So I'm getting to that age, but it's been wonderful. As you said, 3 of the people who worked with us at WHD are now university professors. There's Madhava, there's Anjana Silva, who's at Rajarata University, and there's Kalana at Peradeniya. Kalana Madhuvage, astonishingly clever people. And there's many others who have been working over the years. And right now I'm working with a guy called Hiranya Sodasinghe, who co-authored a book with me last year on the biogeography of Sri Lanka, and especially the freshwater fishes. So this is an ongoing project, and I worry only that I won't live long enough to see enough students through into successful careers. I'd like that excites me a lot to see these guys doing good things with their lives.
Yeah, in fact, you are the one who supported me when I came back when we started that canopy study. Got
Yes.
Fogger, and that really helped for me to start off my career.
Yes.
But when I look at your work, I think the most decisive piece of work you came up with was the amphibians. Because after Keith Singer, no one has really taken much notice about it, but you came and turned tables and said we could be having as much as 250. I remember that was the first time I met you actually in Kandy. We were at a meeting where you presented that paper, and then Biju followed it up with the work in India. Um, would you call that the most decisive point in your career of you know the career of being a naturalist, or what would you call the most decisive achievement
Um,
over the years?
yeah. So 250 species was a gross overestimate. We were over by 50%. But I'm not ashamed about that, because I think there was so much to be discovered that we like set out the parameters for what there was to be discovered. And I think new amphibian species will be continue to be described, because in the last in the last 10 years, for example, Mendis Wickramasinghe has been doing some fantastic work and rediscovering some of the species that we thought were extinct because we hadn't found them, like Pseudophylatus stellatus. And so this has become an exciting project for other people to follow on. So when you ask me about decisive, I worry about that word, because decisive can mean decisive good and decisive bad. And in my past, I don't think so much about the decisive good things, like the things that made a big difference and led to better outcomes. I think more of the negative things. I don't say negative because I'm critical. I'm saying negative like I learned lessons from bad things that happened. And those in a way are also like were important life lessons. So for example, I was working in government service in 1989. And at that time, there were these curfews that were imposed by the JVP, the rebellion that was going on. And they used to tell the whole country to stop work and stay at home as a kind of general strike. But if you're working in an environment that is important to service to the people, you go to work. And in my, except when I was in the health ministry, after that, I've never even taken a salary for working in government, because as a businessman, I had enough income. And so I felt an obligation to report for work. And because I reported for work, my house was attacked, and fortunately we were not at home, and we might have all been killed, because they were killing many people at that time. So that was a decisive moment for us, because we had to decide, like, what do we do? Like, do we remain in Sri Lanka, or do we take refuge in another country? So as it was, we made a kind of compromise. We took my family, my wife and 2 children, to Australia and settled them there. And then I came back and decided that I'm going to continue doing what I was doing with the government at the time. So in a way, that was a decisive move, because it forced me to like think about career. And that was the time I thought, if I'm going to do some research on something like fish, I better start doing it now. So in the early days of my fish research, the first time I went to Laggala Pallegama, for example, and to find what we now call Cystomus martinsteini, which is a beautiful new species, I actually went with an army bodyguard with me in case there was some problem. Not that I asked for it, it was given to me by the army, because that was how it worked. So my field work in those days was done with a guy standing over me with a gun, which is crazy. But now, looking back, I think that was a decisive moment, because it forced me to confront the fact that it was urgent that I do this work with fish that I wanted to do. So bad thing, but good outcome.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I feel the same way after 2009 when we started working in in Jaffna, we had to be escorted by military all the time. But I also know that you tried a lot of innovative things. One of which I remember is you tried to set up a biodiversity institute, which didn't come through. Unfortunately, I thought that was a very, very useful thing for the country to have. So the question I have is what kind of challenges did you face during your work that spans more than 3 decades now? If you would, educate us about the challenges and how did you overcome it? That would be very useful, especially in the today's context, because we live in a challenging time. So would like to know your thoughts about that.
So, yeah, I think you brought up a good point, but I want to rewind that a little bit as to why the instance that you gave came about. So if you look at the 2020 Red List of Threatened Species, I don't know, there are hundreds of Sri Lankan species that are listed as critically endangered. I think correctly so. And I think you have personally been involved in this process for the last 15 or 20 years, helping to do the analysis and crunch the data and come up with these assessments. And I think the assessments are fine. In fish, for example, we have 12 that are critically endangered. In plants, we have almost 300 amongst flowering plants alone. Again, මේ විශේෂ වඳවීමේ තර්ජනයට ආසන්නයි. හැබැයි අපට ශාක විශේෂ 250ක් තියෙන 295ක් තියෙනවා නම් වඳවීමේ තර්ජනයට ආසන්න අපි මේවායේ සංරක්ෂණය ගැන කුමක්ද කරන්නේ? අපේ වනජීවී හා වෘක්ෂලතා ආඥාපනත අනුව අපි මේ සත්ව ශාක සම්පතට ලබා දෙන්නේ ආරක්ෂාව පමණයි. සංරක්ෂණය නෙවෙයි. සංරක්ෂණය කියන වචනේ මට මතක හැටියට ආඥා පනතේ පළවෙනි වාක්‍යයේ පමණයි සඳහන් වෙන්නේ. ඒකේ ඇතුළ කොහෙවත් සඳහන් වෙන්නේ සංරක්ෂණය අපි ලබා දෙනවයි කියලා අපේ ජෛව විවිධත්ව ධනයට. මේක දුර්වලකමක්. ඉතින් මට වැටෙන විදිහට මම කල්පනා කරන්නේ මේ රතු ලයිස්තුවෙන් රෙඩ් ලිස්ට් එකෙන් කිසිම ප්‍රයෝජනයක් නැහැ කියලා අපි ඒ ගැන කිසිම දෙයක් කරන්නේ නැත්තම්. ඉතින් දැන් අපි අපේ මත්ස්‍ය සම්පත ගත්තා නම් අපිට ඉන්නවා කියමු උදාහරණයක් වශයෙන් බන්දුල පෙතියා. බන්දුල පෙතියා මේ ගලපිට මඩ එක පොඩි දොලකට සීමිතයි. ඒක ලංකාවට ආවේනික මත්ස්‍යයක් ලෝකෙ වෙන කොහෙවත් නැහැ. ඒ ගමට සීමිතයි. ඒ ගමේ අයගේ ආරක්ෂාව නැතුව ඒ සතා පවතින්නේ නැහැ. නමුත් අපි වනජීවී සංරක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවේ පැත්තෙන් බැලුවොත් නැත්නම් අපි සංරක්ෂණ විශේෂඥයෝ හැටියට බැලුවොත් ඒ ප්‍රශ්නේ අපිට මේ සතා ගැන යම්කිසි උනන්දුවක් දක්වන්න වෙනව නේද? ඒ කියන්නේ මේක ලේසියෙන් නැති වෙන්න පුළුවන්, වඳ වෙන්න පුළුවන්. කවුරු හරි ගිහිල්ලා වස ටිකක් දැම්ම නම් ඒ දොලට නැත්තම් දොල හිඳිලා ගියා නම් මොකක් හරි පායන කාලෙක ඉඩෝරයක් තිබිලා එහෙම ප්‍රශ්නයකට මොන දෙන්න සිදු වුණොත් ඒ සතා නැති වෙන්න පුළුවන්. නමුත් අපි විද්‍යාත්මක සංරක්ෂණ කළමනාකාර මැදිහත් වීමක් කරන්නේ මේ මත්ස්‍ය ගැන. ඒක දුර්වලකමක්. අනිත් එක තියෙන්නේ අපිට දැන් ඉහළ පෙළේ conservation biology කියන විෂය මම හිතනවා දැන් ඉතාමත්ම දියුණුයි. ඔබතුමත් දේවක ඒකට ඉතාමත්ම ඉහළ පෙළේ ප්‍රමුඛතාවයක් ලබා ගත්ත පුද්ගලයෙක්. ඉතින් ඔබෙන් අපට ප්‍රයෝජනයක් ගන්න බැරිද මේ මත්ස්‍ය පමණක් නෙවෙයි අපේ රටේ ඉන්න මේ CR critically endangered කියන සත්ව විශේෂ 100 ගණනට උන්ගෙන් ස්වල්පයක්වත් සංරක්ෂණය කරගන්න. ආරක්ෂාව පමණක් නෙවෙයි නිකන් වැටක් බැඳලා මදි. අපි බලන්න ඕනේ තව අවුරුදු 50කින් මේ කොහොම තර්ජනයක් මතුවේද කියලා මේ සතාට. කැප්ටිව් බ්‍රීඩින් වගේ දේවල් කරලා අපි මේ සත්තු බේර ගන්න අපි යම්කිසි වැඩපිළිවෙලක් ආරම්භ කර යුතුයි. හැබැයි අපට වනජීවී සංරක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවේ DWC එකට අපි අවශ්‍ය සම්පත් ලබා දෙන්නේ. ඒගොල්ලන්ට ඉඩ දෙන්නේ කන්සර්වේෂන් බයොලොජි විශේෂඥයන් ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ ස්ටාෆ් එකට එකතු කරගන්න. මම දන්න හැටියට හරි ටික දෙනා ඉන්නේ. ඒ සංරක්ෂණ කටයුතු වලට අවශ්‍ය මුදල් හා වෙනත් සම්පත් ලබා දෙන්න අපි කරන්න. ඉතින් මම ඒ අවස්ථාවේ මම හිතනවා මම මේ 2001 2 වගේ කාලේ මම හිතුවා ලංකාවට අපිට ලබා ගන්න පුළුවන් නම් ජෛව විවිධත්ව පර්යේෂණ ආයතනයක් biodiversity research institute කියලා. ඒ කියන්නේ අපේ දැන් ඉහළ පෙළේ අපි conservation scientist ලා අපි විශ්වවිද්‍යාල වලින් උපාධි දීලා එළියට එනවා. හැබැයි ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ විශේෂත්වයෙන් ප්‍රයෝජනයක් රටට ලබා දෙන්න අවස්ථාවක් තිබුණේ නැහැ. ඉතින් මේ වගේ ආයතනයකට මම රජයත් එක්ක කතා කරනකොට ආණ්ඩුවෙන් කිව්වේ අපිට මේකට සල්ලි නැහැ කියලා. ඉතින් මම හිතුවා හරි මම බලන්නම් සල්ලි හොයාගන්න. ඉතින් මම ලෝකෙ වටේ ගියා මගේ මුදල් වලින් ගිහිල්ලා සල්ලි එකතු කරන්න බැලුවා. ඒ හොඳ අවස්ථාවක් වුණා. ඒ කියන්නේ අපිට 2001 අග කාලේ LTT එකෙන් ගැහුවා අපේ එයාපෝට් එකට. මම හිතනවා ගුවන් යාන 10ක් 15ක් විනාශ කරලා. ඉතින් ලංකාව ගැන උනන්දුවක් තිබුණා ලෝකෙ හැමතැනම. අද වගේ නෙවෙයි. ඉතින් ඒ කාලේ අපි ගිහිල්ලා මුදල් ඉල්ලනකොට ගොඩක් අය කිව්වා. ඉතින් මම ඇමරිකාවෙන් ගිහිල්ලා අහනකොට මට එහෙ ඇමතිවරියත් එක්ක මට අවස්ථාවක් දුන්නා ගිහිල්ලා සාකච්ඡා කරන්න. එතුමිය කිව්වේ හරි ලංකාවෙන් අපිට ණය මුදලක් ගෙවන්න තියෙනවා ඩොලර් මිලියන 10ක් විතර. අපි හදලා දෙන්න දාන්න
Did we lost Rohan?
How long have I been lost?
Just about a minute. Yeah, less than a minute. You're okay.
Right, less than a minute. It's asking me something and I'll hang on. 1 minute. Okay. Did I start saying about collecting money for this?
Yes.
For the Biodiversity Institute?
that
ඉතින්
US
අන්තිමට අපි හොයාගත්ත US dollars මිලියන 23ක්. ඒ කියන්නේ අද සල්ලි වලින් රුපියල් බිලියන බයන්න රුපියල් බිලියන 8ක් පමණ විශාල මුදලක්. අපි බැලුවා නම් වන සංරක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවේ වාර්ෂික වියදම පිරිවැය දැනට මම හිතනවා බිලියන 7ක් විතර වෙනවා මේ වසරේ. ඉතින් ඊටත් වඩා ගාණක් මේ පොඩි ආයතනයක් වෙනුවෙන් අපි හොයාගත්තා. ඉතින් මං හිතුවා මේක බොහොම හොඳයි කියලා. අනිත් එක ඒ කාලෙත් අමුතු ආණ්ඩුවක් තිබුණේ චන්ද්‍රිකා කුමාරතුංග මේ ජනාධිපතිවරිය හැටියට හිටිය රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ අගමැතිවරයා හැටියට. දෙන්න එකට හිටියේ නැහැ. ඒ කියන්නේ කැබිනට් එකේ ભેදයක් තිබුණා. ජනාධිපතිවරයා වෙන පක්ෂයකින්. නමුත් ඒගොල්ලන් දෙන්නම එකග වුණා මේක අපි ඇති කර යුතුයි කියලා. ඉතින් දෙන්නම මේකට සහයෝගය ලබා දුන්නා. ඒකත් එක්කම කැබිනට් තීරණයක් ගත්තා මේක රටට අවශ්‍ය දෙයක් මේක කරන්න දෙන්න අපිට දෙන්න ඉඩ දෙන්න කියලා. අනිත් එක මේ ආණ්ඩුවේ වාසියක් තිබුණා. හැබැයි මම එක පැත්තක් බැලුවේ නෑ. මට අර මගේ මම කියවනේ මේ මම සමාජශීලී පුද්ගලෙක් නෙවෙයි කියලා. මට මේක කල්පනා වුණේ නෑ මේක ගැන අනිකුත් අය මොකක්ද ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ මතය මොකක්ද කියලා මේ ගැන. ඉතින් මේක මුලින්ම පොඩි විදියට නමුත් ශීඝ්‍රයෙන් ඉතාමත්ම බරපතල ප්‍රශ්නයක් වුණා. පත්‍ර වල කතා ලියනවා අපි මේ ඇමරිකාවට සිංහරාජ විකුණන්න බලනවා. පෙතියගොඩ කියන්නේ ජාන මංකොල්ලකාරයෙක්. මේකට ආධාරයෙන් එක NGO එකක් තියෙනවා කන්සර්වේෂන් ඉන්ටර්නැෂනල් ලෝකෙ විශාලම කන්සර්වේෂන් NGO එක. ඒකේ සභාපතිවරයා ජාන මංකොල්ලකාරයෙක් ඒ වගේ මාධ්‍යවල එන්න ආව කතාව. මේක ඉතින් මට උත්තරයක් දෙන්න බැරි වුණා. ඒ කියන්නේ මගෙන් කවුරුත් ප්‍රශ්නයක් අහන්නේ නැහැ. නිකන් පිටිපස්සෙන් කට කතා හැටියට මේ කියන්නේ මාධ්‍යවල යනවා, පත්‍රවල යනවා, කැලෑ පත්‍ර යනවා. ඒ කාලේ මේ ඊමේල් එහෙම ටිකක් අඩුයි. මේ දැන් 2004 2005 ඒ කාලේ. අන්තිමට අපේ ප්‍රධානම සංවිධානයක මේ රජය නොවන සංවිධානයක් වන WNPS එක. ඒකේ හිටපු සභාපතිවරයෙක් ටෙලිවිෂන් එකේ කිව්වා රොස්මිටමය ඩොක්ටර් රොස්මිටමය වන කන්සර්වේෂන් ඉන්ටර්නැෂනල් සමාගමේ ආයතනයේ මේ ප්‍රධානයා බ්‍රසීලයේ මේ වගේ මේ බයෝපයිරසි නඩුවක් උඩ එතුමා ජාන මංකොල්ලකාරයෙක් කියලා. එයාට කවුද මේ වීඩියෝ එක යවුවා. එයාට යවුවම එයා කිව්වා නෑ එහෙනම් අපි ලංකාවට කිසිම ආධාරයක් දෙන්නේ නෑ කියලා. එතකොට එයා ඒකෙන් අයින් වෙනකොට ඒ ව්‍යාපෘතයෙන් අයින් වෙනකොට අනිත් ආධාරකරුවෝ සියල්ලම අයින් වුණා යත් එක්කම. ඉතින් ප්‍රොජෙක්ට් එක නැති වුණා. නමුත් මොකද්ද ඒකේ ප්‍රතිපාකය? ඒ ප්‍රොජෙක්ට් එකට තිබුණ මිලියන 23 ගියා ඉන්දියාවට. ඉතින් අපට ලැබෙන්න තිබුණ ජෛව විවිධත්ව පර්යේෂණ ආයතනය දැන් තියෙන්නේ බැංගලෝර නගරේ. ඉතින් ඒකෙන් අපට පේනවා සමහර විට අපේ පරිසරවේදීන් කල්පනා කරන විදිය. ඉතින් ඒකත් දේවක මගෙන් ඇහුවා මගේ decisive moments මොකක්ද කියලා. ඒකත් decisive moment එකක් වුණා. ඉතින් මම එදා තීරණය කරා මේ WST එකේ කරන තීරුමක් නැහැ කියලා. රටට මේක තේරෙන්නේ නැහැ. අපි කරන දේ තේරෙන්නේ නැහැ. කවදා හරි තේරෙයි. හැබැයි මට ඉවසිල්ල නැහැ. එදා වෙනකන් ඉන්න. ඉතින් මම තීරණය කරා එදාම වහලා දාන්න. ඒකයි උනේ.
ඒක මම හිතන අපිට වෙච්ච ලොකු පාඩුවක් කියලා. මොකද ඒ කාලේ පෑම් අපිට ග්‍රාන්ට් එකක් ඇවිල්ලා තිබුණා. World Bank project එකේ මමත් වැඩ කරේ. ඒ මමත් මම හිතන්නේ ඒ පැත්තෙන් ගොඩක් ඒකට අවශ්‍ය කරන ලිපි ගොනු සකස් කරලා දුන්නා. මම හිතනවා අපිට ලැබිච්ච ලොකු පරාජයක් එක කියලා. අපේ රටේ ඉතිහාසයේ දේශ බලද්දී වගේ පරාජය ගොඩක් තියෙනවා. මම හිතන්නේ AIT වගේ ගොඩක් දේවල් අපිට නැති වුණේ අපි දුරදිග බලලා වැඩ නොකරපු හින්දා. ඔබ බන්දුල පිටිය ගැන මතක් කරපු හින්දා මට එකක් කියන්න ඕනේ. අපි රිකවරි ප්‍රෝග්‍රෑම් එකක් කරා. පොපියුලේෂන් ඉඳලා දැන් 2000කට පමණ වැඩි කරගෙන අපිට හැකි වුණා. අපි එකෙන් 20ක් හඳුන්වා දුන්නා. ඒ ළඟම තියෙන 12කට එතනක් දැන් හොඳ ගහනයක් ඉන්නවා. ඉතින් නමුත් මම විශ්වාස කරනවා ඔබ කියපු දේ හරි. අපි දිගින් දිගටම පරිසර අමාත්‍යාංශයට කිව්වේ මේ යකුලයිස්තුව හදන එක හරියට ලෙඩෙක්ගේ ලෙඩේ හොයාගන්න එක විතරයි. ප්‍රතිකාර කරේ නැත්තම් ලෙඩේ හොයාගෙන වැඩක් නැහැ කියන එක අපි දිගින් දිගටම කිව්වා. නමුත් මේ දක්වා අවාසනාවකට ඒ දෙවෙනි ක්‍රියාවලිය සිදු වෙලා නැහැ. මම හිතනවා ඔබටත් මටත් දෙදෙනාටම දිගින් දිගටම මේ පිළිබඳව යම් බලපෑමක් කරන්න වෙයි කියලා. මම අපේ කාල වේලාවත් අවසන් වීගෙන යන හින්දා මට තව එක ප්‍රශ්නයක් අහන්න ඕනේ. ඔබ ලිනෙන් මෙඩල් එක දිනා ගැනීම මම හිතන්නේ ඔබට ලොකු ජයග්‍රහණයක්, රටට ලොකු ආඩම්බරයක්. ඒ ගැන මොකද ඔබට හිතේ? How do you feel about being the recipient of the Linnean Medal?
ඇත්ත කියන්න අවංකව කියනවා නම් දේවක දැන් රටේ තත්ත්වය බලනකොට මට ඒ ගැන කල්පනා කරන්නවත් අවස්ථාවක් ලැබිලා නැහැ. මේක මට පෞද්ගලිකව අදාළ නැහැ. මම මේ අද අපි වැටිලා තියෙන අගාධය ගැන මට කලින්ම වැටහුණා. මම හිතනවා දැන් අවුරුදු 2කට විතර කලින් මම පටන් ගත්තා මේකට සූදානම් වෙන්න. ඉතින් මට පෞද්ගලිකව ප්‍රශ්නයක් නැහැ. හැබැයි රට ගැන මට වේදනාවක් තියෙනවා. ඉතින් ලිනියන් මේ පදක්කම ගැන මට ඉංගලන්තයට යන්නත් හිතුන්නේ නැහැ ඇත්ත කියන්න. මෙතන අපි මුණ දෙන ප්‍රශ්න බලනකොට අපේ ජනතාව විශේෂයෙන්ම අපේ ගම්බද ජනතාව දැන් බඩගින්නෙන් දරිද්‍රතාවයෙන් පෙළෙන ජනතාවක් අපිට ඉන්නවා. මම හිතනවා අපිට සේරම රට මේක තේරෙනවා අපි හැමෝටම. ඉතින් මේ මේවා ගැන අපි මේ ඔය Linnean Medal එක ගැන අපි මම කල්පනා කරලවත් නැත්ත කියන්න. මම ගෙදර ආවා ඒක මගේ වයිෆ්ට දීලා මගේ වැඩ පටන් ගත්තයි. මේ ඒක මම හිතන්නේ මම කාටවත් මගේ දරුවන්ටවත් මම පෙන්වුවයි කියලා ඇත්ත කියන්න. මේ අපිට ඊට වඩා බරපතල ප්‍රශ්න තියෙනවා දැන්. මම දැන්
ඒ වගේම මම දකිනවා මම ඔබගේ ජීවිතය දිහා බලද්දී දකිනවා transitions කීපයක්. පළවෙනි එක තමයි ඉංජිනේරුවෙක් ඉඳලා ස්වභාව විද්‍යාඥයෙක් වෙන්න. මෑත කාලේදී මම ඔබගේ YouTube එකේ ගිය වැඩසටහන් ගණනාවක් බොහොම ආසාවෙන් බැලුවා. මට හිතුණා ඔබ ක්‍රියාකාරී එක් වෙලා කියලා. I think you turn into an activist. How do you feel about that?
නෑ මම ඇක්ටිවිස්ට් නෙවෙයි. මට විශේෂ දෙයක් තියෙන්නේ මම බලනවා අපේ විශේෂයෙන් අපේ තරුණ අය මේ අද මේ වැඩසටහනට එකතු වෙලා ඉන්න අයට අපේ ජාතික ප්‍රතිපත්ති අපේ ජාතික සංවර්ධනය ගැන කල්පනා කරනකොට විවේචනාත්මක චින්තනයක් ඇතුව මේක ගැන බලන්නේ කියලා. ඒ කියන්නේ critical thinking හැටියට. හැම දෙයකටම දෙපැත්තක් තියෙනවා. අපි අනිවාර්යෙන් දෙපැත්ත බැලිය යුතුයි. හැම යෝජනාවකටම දෙපැත්තක් තියෙනවා. හැබැයි අපි විශේෂයෙන් පරිසර ක්ෂේත්‍රයේ අපි බලන්නේ අර ඍණාත්මක පැත්ත පමණයි. අපි ධනාත්මක පැත්ත බලන්නේ. මට අවස්ථාවක් මට විනාඩියක් දුන්නොත් මම ඉක්මනට උදාහරණයක් දෙන්න. මම හිතනවා 2004 මාව පත් කරා අර ඉහළ කොත්මලේ ව්‍යාපෘතියේ තිබුණ ප්‍රශ්නයක්. ඒක අවුරුදු 5ක් විතර කල් ගියා. ජපානයෙන් ලබන ආධාර වලින් මේ සුළු ප්‍රොජෙක්ට් එකක් මේ තලවකැලේ කරපු ප්‍රොජෙක්ට් එකක්. මාව පත් කරා මේකේ අර පරිසර what do you call it for the EIA to decide for the government whether it's a good EIA or a bad EIA. මට ඒ වගේ ටාස්ක් එකක් දුන්නා කරන්න මේ EIA එක ගැන වාර්තාවක් ලබා දෙන්නයි කියලා රජයට කැබිනට් තීරණයකින් මට මේක පවරා දුන්නා. මේ ප්‍රොජෙක්ට් එක මම හිතනවා ඉතාමත් පොඩි ප්‍රොජෙක්ට් එකක් කියලා. මේ ජලාශය මම හිතනවා ඉඩ ප්‍රමාණය අක්කර 60යි. අක්කර 60ක් කියන්නේ ඉතාමත් පොඩි ජලාශයක්. ජලාශයක් කියන්නේ බෑ පොකුණක් වගේ. නමුත් ඒකෙන් අපිට වාර්ෂිකව ලැබෙනවා දැන් ගිගවොට් hours 400ක්. ඒ කියන්නේ රුපියල් බිලියන 12ක බයන්න. බිලියන 12ක විදුලිය වටිනාකම. මම හිතනවා බිලියන 12ක් කියන්නේ ඒ පොඩි ජලාශය ඒ බලාගාරයෙන් අපිට ලැබෙනවා කොළඹ විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයට වැය වෙන වාර්ෂික මුදල. ඒ අතින් බැලුවා. හැබැයි මේකට අපි අවුරුදු 4ක් ගියානේ පරිසර වේදීන් මේකට විරුද්ධ වෙලා කිව්වා නායම් සිදුවේයි එතන තියෙන ජනතාවට තර්ජනයක් තිබුණා කියලා. මේක අවුරුදු ගාණක්ම ඇද්දා ජපාන් ආධාර වලින් ආපු ප්‍රොජෙක්ට් එකක්. තව පොඩ්ඩෙන් මේක කැන්සල් වෙනවා. අපි හැබැයි ඒක වෙලාවට බේරගෙන දැන් අපේ ඒ ප්‍රොජෙක්ට් එක අපිට ලබා දුන්නා. ඉතින් මම හැම ව්‍යාපාරයකට හැම ව්‍යාපෘතියකටම විරුද්ධ වෙන පරිසර වේදීන්ගෙන් මම අහා සිටින්නේ පොඩ්ඩක් කල්පනා කරන්න රටේ සංවර්ධනය ගැන. අපි මේ සංවර්ධනය අපට අවශ්‍යයි. මට අවශ්‍ය නැහැ. හැබැයි අපේ ගම්වල ඉන්න දරුවන්ට අයිතියක් තියෙනවා විදුලි එළියෙන් ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ ගෙදර වැඩ කරන්න හවස. පහන් එළියෙන් නෙවෙයි. ඒ වගේ අයිතිකම් තියෙනවා. ඉතින් අපිට ඒගොල්ලන්ට විදුලිය ලබා දෙන්න ඕනේ. අනිත් එක ඒ කාලේ යෝජනා කරේ අපි මේ ප්‍රොජෙක්ට් එක මේ හයිඩ්‍රෝ ඉලෙක්ට්‍රික් පවර් ප්‍රොජෙක්ට් එකක් දාන්න ඕනේ මේක මේ සූර්ය බලයෙන් කරගන්න පුළුවන් කියලා. හැබැයි සූර්ය බලයෙන් කරන්න යනවා නම් ඒකෙන් ඉහළ කොත්මලේ ව්‍යාපෘතයෙන් ලැබෙන විදුලියට අපට ඉඩම් අක්කර 1200ක් ඕන වෙනවා. තේරුමක් නැති වැඩක් නේ. ඉඩම් අක්කර 1200ක් යොදවනවා නම් මේ සූර්ය බල ප්‍රොජෙක්ට් එකක් කරන්න මේ අක්කර 60න් කරගන්න පුළුවන් වැඩේට. මොකද අපි විරුද්ධ වෙන්නේ. ඉතින් ඒගොල්ලන්ට කිව්වට ඒක පිළිගන්නේ නැහැ. ඉතින් අපේ පරිසරය නියාමනය කරන අධිකාරියට CEA එකට මම හිතනවා මේ යම්කිසි මේ අපි අවබෝධයක් ලබා දිය යුතුයි පරිසර වේදීන්ට. ඉස්සෙල්ලාම රටේ සංවර්ධන ඉලක්ක මොකක්ද? අපේ පරිසර ක්ෂේත්‍රයට අදාළ වෙන ඉලක්ක මොකක්ද කියලා. මේ දෙක ගැලපෙන්නේ නැති විදිහකට දැන් තියෙන්නේ. ඉතින් ඒ හින්දා ප්‍රොජෙක්ට්ස් ගොඩක් කල් ගියා අපිට දැන් තියෙන අර්බුදයත් ඒකේ කොටසක්. අපිම හදාගත්ත අර්බුදයක් මේක.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more about the need for us to be critical thinkers, especially the younger generation, which brings me to my last question. What advice would you, because today you would notice that we have a large number of aspiring young zoologists, botanists listening to you, and they're inspired by you. What is a piece of advice that you can give to these youngsters?
So for any zoologists or botanists who are becoming graduates in that field, especially if they have done special degrees and if they are motivated in that field, I would urge them to write. You don't need to publish papers in high-wire journals. Write at least Wikipedia articles. There are still many things for which Wikipedia articles are incomplete. There are very few tree species in Sri Lanka for which endemic tree species for which there are Wikipedia articles. For example, bringing together the information on what the flower is like, because now photographs are available for all these things. That's at the minimum level. At the maximum level, I would say do publishable research. This is not difficult to do. I give the example of the last medicine Nobel Prize that was won by the Australian pair. I forget their names now, Devaka. They did research that could have been done in a district hospital in Sri Lanka. This was the people who discovered that this Helicobacter bacteria is what causes stomach ulcers. This is basically some research that could have been done with a normal compound microscope in a small hospital lab. So I think curiosity is the main thing. If you are curious and we're asking searching questions, then I think there are many interesting answers to be found. So I would urge people, especially if they're doing special degrees and looking to do postgraduate work, to start publishing as soon as they can, and especially even before they leave university. I made it a condition. The last student I supervised or helped to supervise was Hiranya Sudasinghe. And I think by the time he graduated with his bachelor's degree, he had about 5 or 6 publications already. And I think that was a fantastic achievement. And I would like to see every motivated bachelor's degree, special degree holder coming out of university with a couple of publications under their belt, because that helps you then to leverage and get grants to go overseas for higher studies, for PhDs and so on, and build a much better career. So remember, you are a scientist, first of all, a scientist, and scientists have to publish, and scientists have to keep thinking of hypotheses that they will test. So if you don't do that, it's very difficult to be a successful scientist. So my advice is don't go to taxonomy. Taxonomy is too easy. You are preparing these students, you're equipping them with much better skills to be doing the more difficult things and answering the difficult questions. So use your curiosity to answer difficult questions and publish the results. This is not expensive, it's not difficult, and it's the starting point for a good scientific career.
Thank you, Rohan. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. As much as I would like to continue this discussion, I would have to turn you back to the question and answer session. So I'm going to ask Ashma to come back and start the question and answer session. I'm sure they will have lots of questions for you. Thank you once again, Rohan.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Devaka Weerakoon, for conducting that interesting discussion. Okay, with that, I'm sure that by now all of you have been inspired by this great personality. So without a delay, we'll now move on to the Q&A session. We already have received some questions via the chat box and the Google form that we shared with our participants beforehand. If you do have more questions, we request you to send them to the chat box for the person who has been renamed as questions, so we can direct them to Mr. Pethiyagoda. So, sir, the first questions that we have received is, what are your plans in conservation for the future?
I think the short answer to that is right now, I'm not thinking in terms of any big conservation projects. There is one project I would like to start. I'll just quickly describe it. There is a tea estate called Udaveriya adjoining Houghton Plains. There is this Devil's Staircase roadway that goes from near Belluloya up to Houghton Plains on the Ohio side. Udaveriya is about 700 hectares and it's a very steep land. So the NBRO has declared that they can't cultivate tea there any longer. So I would like to start a project by getting some international aid to reforest this 700 acres is a 700 hectares is a massive area to reforest, but to reforest it and one day join it up with Houghton Plains National Park if possible. Some work has already been done on this by others, but so I want to help with that project. But that is just one small project. On the rest of conservation, I'm not thinking right now. My mind is focused on the economic recovery for the country. I want to be involved in that because I think if we don't have a country that is growing economically, there is no point in talking about conservation. People are not going to think about conservation. We need to fill the stomach first and then talk about conservation. Otherwise, even now, because there is no gas, no kerosene, people are cutting down forests for firewood, for timber. This is going to continue. So we have to think about national development. අපි අර්බුදයෙන් එළියට එමු ඉස්සෙල්ලා ඊට පස්සේ සංරක්ෂණය ගැන සාකච්ඡාව පටන් ගමු. ඒකයි මම කියන්නේ.
Yes, absolutely, sir. Thank you very much for that interesting answer. And the next question is, what are the ways that the general interested public and organizations can contribute in biodiversity conservation missions if they would like to work with that?
I think one of the best ways to set about this is to make sure that enough people are getting information in Sinhala. This is something we started in the 1990s, I think, with Professor Kotagama in 1994. For the first time, we published a comprehensive book in Sinhala on the birds of Sri Lanka. That sold very well, and then he did a bigger book with Mr. Gamini Ratnaveera as the artist. And Sirilaka Kurullo was a bestseller. I think more than 20,000 copies were sold. We gave one free copy to every school library in Sri Lanka. This was almost 20 years ago. And still, when I go in the field sometimes and I see a kid with an old copy of Sirilaka Kurullo who's using it, I feel very proud. Of course, after that, there have been many books in Sinhala on these subjects. But I think education and awareness building, especially in Sinhala, because university graduates are equipped in both languages, and you all have a big advantage because you can assimilate information in English and then disseminate that in Sinhala. So awareness meetings are a good thing to do, and raising funding for that. So for example, in Kanneliya, there is a very nice facility, the dormitories there, or in Houghton Plains, and to take senior school children on field trips, get them used to the idea of how to observe nature in a scientific way, and to have fellowship and lectures and meetings with them, I think is a lovely thing to do. And if you all are doing that and you'll like me to help find some money, I'd be happy to do that. But I think that's really valuable. Teaching is the best way to learn. I think Professor Devaka will agree.
Yes, of course. So the next question is, sir, what do you think about the current status of biodiversity of Sri Lanka when it compared to the world?
We are in a bad situation. Our population density is quite high. We are about 380 people per square kilometer now. In the wet zone, it's about almost 800 people per square kilometer. The wet zone is where most of our biodiversity is concentrated. And our whole conservation and protection effort is focused largely on elephants. Because of that, we don't focus on conserving, for example, dragonflies or small fish and things like this, which might need more attention and are more unique to Sri Lanka than large animals. So I think the conservation of these animals is in a critical state. we are losing a wet zone forest at a huge rate. And now, because of the present problems, the rate of forest loss around peak wilderness, Orton Plains, Piduru Thalagala, Hantana, Knuckles, and so on is getting to be an unbearable rate of forest loss. So we will see many more species coming to be critically endangered. And so I think going forward, what I would like to see is putting more pressure on government to allow universities, for example, to get involved in actual conservation work. Devise a program like Professor Devaka was saying, like he's been doing for the Bandula Bab, but there are so many other species also that need attention. So that each group of students, for example, can take care of how to make a management plan and implement it for really threatened species, not just of animals, but also of plants, because there are many more plants seem to have become extinct in Sri Lanka than animals so far, certainly vertebrate animals. So conservation here is in trouble, and it needs a new aragale from you, the intelligent young people, to pull it out of this problem.
Yes, thank you, sir. And our next question is, sir, as a developing country, lots of development projects are happening. So how can we balance both conservation and sustainable development, sir?
So I think the thing is to be reasonable. And very often we haven't been reasonable. This is a problem that really bugs me. If there is one question that I stay awake at night thinking about, it is this question you asked me. How do we find this balance? And how do we sell that balance to the people who are making decisions? The people who are making decisions are not so much politicians. They are people like you guys, because you are the ones who will be out there protesting if you don't agree with something. So I think informing the young graduates who are in university and coming out of university about the real development needs of the country is very important. I'll give you a quick example. 22 years ago, some environmentalists went to the Supreme Court and they got a decision, a judgment from the Supreme Court prohibiting any development work of the Epavala phosphate deposit. The problem with Supreme Court ruling 22 years ago is that it confused two words. It confused the word Samchita with the word Sampat, reserves as opposed to resources. Edaka kawalam hinda then apate niyogya nisa එප්පාවල සංවර්ධනය කරන්න බෑ. නමුත් ඒකත් එක්කම අපි වාර්ෂිකව ට්‍රිපල් සුපර් ෆොස්ෆේට් ටොන් ලක්ෂයක් පමණ ආනයනය කරනවා. විදේශ විනිමය වැය කරලා. So that is a massive loss to the country because we are desperately in need of fertilizer. We have one of the biggest phosphate deposits in Asia sitting right just down south of Anuradhapura. And for the last 22 years, we are importing phosphates. So this is a development problem that is caused by a group of environmentalists. But after that happened, I haven't seen any environmentalists going to the Supreme Court and saying, actually, we were wrong. We need this phosphate for agriculture. We need this phosphate to export and bring foreign exchange. Of course, phosphate mining has environmental problems, but let's find out how we can get around those environmental problems. Because remember that even if you have to correct the environmental problems, that takes labor, and labor means jobs for our people. We need to find jobs for our people. So I gave that example just to show that in many cases, we environmentalists are responsible for holding back the development of our country and getting us into this situation. We have to get loans for everything because we don't allow our own resources to be used sustainably. So we need to think very carefully about how we measure this. Last year, I took another example. In fact, I spoke to the wildlife department about it because we have this problem of biopiracy. There are people who we know are coming to Sri Lanka and stealing specimens. This is insulting because we used to be a colony, and when people, especially white people, come and steal animals from whether it's dragonflies or butterflies or beetles, we don't like it. But it's not a serious conservation threat. But as a result of the awareness that we have built up about this subject, many tourists who come here and are interested in wildlife are thought to be biopirates. So there have been cases where even a friend of mine who came, and he was just watching people fishing beside my house, because I have a small canal here in Tadawattugoda where I live. Ichthyologist friend from Singapore, and a man was catching fish and had them in a bucket, and he went and looked at what the species were, because he's an ichthyologist. He was reported to the police. So we give a bad impression for tourists when we have this overhyping of this problem. Of course, we have a biopiracy problem. And of course, the people who come and steal specimens should be arrested. And like that last group was fined, they should be fined 7 or 8 million rupees, quite right. But we should know where to measure that, because we shouldn't do it in a way that harms genuine tourism. Because there was another tourist who was photographing monkeys, I think somewhere near Padukka, who got into trouble because they thought he was a biopirate. So this gives us a bad impression, because these people put it on their blogs and so on, and then Sri Lanka gets a bad reputation. So we should learn to balance. I think this is the way forward. A bit of namyashili praticharyak tibiya yutui, like some kind of flexible in our outlook, in our response.
Okay, sir, thank you. That is very indeed. So there is another very special question that it has asked from our audience. So what is the next possibility of getting the Lost Biodiversity Institute back to Sri Lanka, sir, that you have mentioned earlier?
I think for a long time it will be impossible, to be honest, because we have a bad reputation with the international NGOs now. The whole international NGO system is operated. There are 3 large NGOs: World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International, and the Nature Conservancy. These are all America-based, and they're huge. And we have a pretty bad reputation with all of them, because they talk to each other, and Sri Lanka is not in their good books. By comparison, IUCN is not big. IUCN is a federation of other NGOs. It's not an NGO in itself. So that's not enough. So there is a bigger need than actually an institute at the moment, which is our national debt. If you look up on the internet, you'll see the example of Belize, the country of Belize in Central America. They also got into a similar problem like Sri Lanka, where they couldn't pay back their debts. So they did a thing called a debt for nature swap, which is that big NGOs come and pay off part of the debt, in this case $500 million for Belize, which is a lot of money, on condition that the Belize government put $25 million into conservation. Now $25 million is a lot of money. It's about 10 billion rupees. So Belize had to do something like that. And that was done by the Nature Conservancy, which is one of the big 3 international NGOs. But when I think we have approached Nature Conservancy about doing something like this for Sri Lanka, they're like not so keen, because we have got ourselves a bad reputation. So it will take some effort to get these people to engage again with our country. I'm very sad about that. I'm very disappointed. And you know, the tragedy is the people who objected to this project at that time, in that period, you don't even hear about them today. Nobody knows even the people who went and got this judgment against Epawala, because they do the damage and they disappear. So these are, I see them as traitors, because like in the name of conservation, they go and cause huge damage to the national interest, and then they just disappear. You never hear about them again. So I don't think we'll get the Biodiversity Institute back. It'll be a very difficult thing with the present economic environment, maybe another 20 years before you can even think about it.
Okay, sir. And also we have another question related to the previous one. What would be the role of research scientists in realizing this dream? And is NARA delivering the same research output that was expected from it?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last bit. Is who developing the research output?
NARA delivering the...
I don't know. I'm embarrassed to comment about a particular institution. NARA used to be a research institution in the 1980s. I know they had a strong research interest. I don't know whether that is still part of their mandate, because, you know, a lot of government institutions can only do what the budget lets them do. So if the finance ministry doesn't give them the money to do research, they can't do the research. So you can't blame the institution really. So I'm not sure about NARA. I don't want to go into that. But I think the scope for research in Sri Lanka on biodiversity is just infinite. There's no shortage of hugely interesting questions to ask. This work that I mentioned, which Hiranya Sudhasinghe has been doing, for example, trying to understand how fish historically for the past several million years have been moving between the river basins of Sri Lanka using their genetics, has been fascinating, because we've understood so many things. Like, for example, when there have been droughts in the past, like all the rivers have dried up, where did the residual populations survive? So it's answered like hugely important questions. And with climate change happening, we need to understand more about how our biodiversity is resilient to things like drought, or long periods without rainfall, decreasing rainfall patterns, and so on. So the need for research is just infinitely big, and it's not always expensive. It's quite cheap. I don't know whether anybody from outside of biology is listening today, but something that's really eye-catching research internationally is experimental psychology. And in Sri Lanka, we publish almost no experimental psychology. And this is the cheapest form of research to do with some of the most outstanding publication possibilities in the world, because there is a lot of international interest in experimental psychology. Just Wikipedia, the kinds of things that people are doing in other countries. And here we have a body of students in universities who are wonderful guinea pigs for experimental psychology experiments, who will give their time freely to do these kinds of tests that lead to these fantastic publications. So this is something I think that can be done in any science faculty in the world, and certainly I would encourage even the zoo and botany students to look at doing some experimental psychology stuff with their colleagues. It's eminently publishable, and you might really make some fantastic discoveries. So yeah, research is great. Don't stop thinking about interesting questions. So I'll give you a quick, interesting question to think about. Why do human beings always have their meals together, whether as families or with friends? So just go home and think about that. That's something that's worth researching. Sorry, any more questions?
Yes, sir. We are receiving so many questions, but due to the time restriction, we'll move on to last two questions of this webinar. The audience would like to know if they are at home, and how can we become part of the naturalist in the community as youth who are restricted to their home?
So a fun thing to do is to do some practical skills development at home. If you have a little garden, I think learning to breed some butterflies is a fantastic thing to do, to learn what food plants they like, and to encourage something like breeding butterflies. Keeping aquarium fish is something you learn a lot, especially if you try to breed them and bringing up the young ones. You learn a huge amount about biology by just doing these simple things that you can do at home. And the resources are now available freely on the internet as to how to feed young fish, and how to learn about the different kinds of needs that fish breeders have. And these are useful skills to learn. Even interacting with a pet, training a dog to do some fun stuff is something that will teach you a lot about animal psychology. So I think there's a lot you can do at home. There's certainly a lot I'm doing at home during this time when we're all stuck at home.
Okay, sir. Those are very interesting. And we are now move on to the last question. So it is true that Sri Lanka is going through a tough time right now, which will surely persist for a few more years at least. So as a passionate scientist, do you have any suggestions on what a Sri Lankan scientist's role should be in the present day?
I think the problem that we are having today is entirely as a result of our being led by ideologies and not by critical thinkers. So I think to develop the skill to look at every problem from more than one point of view is a very important thing. So I think if I put it simply, යම්කිසි තර්කයක් කවුරු හරි ඉදිරිපත් කරාට ඒක මතවාදයකින් බලන්න නැතුව ඒක බලන්න දෙපැත්තෙම බලන්න ඉගෙන ගන්න. තව පැත්තක් අනිවාර්යෙන් තියෙනවා. ඒක හොයන්න. ඉතින් මම කිව්වොත් අපිට අලි සංරක්ෂණය කරන්න අවශ්‍ය නැහැ කියලා ලංකාවේ අලි ගහණය 5000ක් විතර ඉන්න හින්දා මේක හදිස්සියක් නැහැ කියලා. එතකොට ඔබට පුළුවන් වෙන්න ඕනේ අනිත් පැත්තෙන් හරවලා බලන්න නෑ ඇත්ත වශයෙන්ම පෙතියගොඩ වැරදිද? මොකද එයා වැරදි කියලා මට පෙන්වන්න හැකි කියලා. කවුරු හරි යමක් කියනකොට හිතන්න එපා එයා හරි කියලා. හිතන්න නෑ එයා වැරදි වෙන්න පුළුවන්. අපි පොඩ්ඩක් මේක විමර්ශනය කරලා බලමු. ඉතින් මම යෝජනා කරන්නේ හැම ප්‍රශ්නයකටම සරල පිළිතුරක් නෑ. සරල පිළිතුරක් තිබුණා නම් අපිට ලෝකේ ප්‍රශ්න නැති වෙනවනේ. ඉතින් අපි හිතන්න ඕනේ අපි කඩා වැටුනේ අපේ ආර්ථිකය කඩා වැටුනේ කොහොමද? අපේ සමාජය කඩා වැටීමෙන් සිටින්නේ කොහොමද? ඒක දැන් අපිට පේනවා. පෙට්‍රල් ෂෙඩ් එකක් බැලුවා නම් රාත්‍රී ප්‍රවෘත්ති වල අපිට පේනවා මොකක්ද වෙන්නේ කියලා. ඉතින් අපි කල්පනා කරන්න ඕනේ අපිට මේක වෙන විදියකට කොහොමද කරන්න පුළුවන්? අපි වැරදුනේ කොහොමද? උද්දමනය මෙහෙම වැඩි වුණේ කොහොමද? අපේ විදේශ සංචිත විනිමය සංචිතය නැති වුණේ කොහොමද? අපි මේවා ගැන කල්පනා කරලා බැලුවා නම් අපිට පේනවා අපි කොහෙද මේක වරදගත්තේ කියලා. කොහෙද අපි මේක අනාගත්තේ කියලා. මේක දේශපාලන ප්‍රශ්නයක් පමණක් නෙවෙයි. මේක විද්වතුන්ගේ ප්‍රශ්නයකුත් වෙනවා. හේතුව මේ තීරණ ගන්න දේශපාලන පමණක් නෙවෙයි. මහා බැංකුවේ තීරණ ගන්න දේශපාලකයෝ නෙවෙයි. මහා බැංකුවේ අධිපතිවරයා නැත්තම් එහි ඉන්න සේවක පිරිස. ඉතින් අපි දැනගන්න ඕනේ ඒගොල්ලන්වත් මෝඩ මිනිස්සු නෙවෙයිනේ. ඒගොල්ලන්වත් දැන් හිටපු මහා බැංකුවේ අධිපතිතුමා කොළඹ විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයේ මහාචාර්යවරයෙක්. ඉතින් එයාටත් මේක වැරදුනා. ඒක අපි පිළිගන්න ඕනේ. හැබැයි කොහෙද වැරදුනේ? මොකද වැරදුනේ? එයා මතවාදයක් නිසා නොමග ගියාද නැත්නම් එයාට තර්ජන තිබුණාද කොහොමද මේක වුනේ? ඉතින් ටිකක් ගැඹුරෙන් කල්පනා කරා නම් අපිට හිතා ගන්න පුළුවන් අපිට වැරදුනේ කොහොමද? අපි මේකෙන් ගොඩ එන්නේ කොහොමද කියලා. ඒක තේරුම් ගන්නේ නැතුව අපි නිකන් ප්‍රාර්ථනා කරන එක මදි මේ අපේ ප්‍රශ්න නැති වෙයි කියලා. අපි ප්‍රශ්න නැති වෙන්නේ නැහැ. අපිට තව පරම්පරාවක් යනවා මේකෙන් ගොඩ එන්න. අපි මොකක් කරත් මේකෙන් හදිස්සියෙන් අපිට ගොඩ එන්න බෑ. ඒක අපි මතක තියාගත යුතුයි. මේකෙන් ගොඩ එන්න පුළුවන් අපේ ශ්‍රමයෙන් පමණයි. මම මේක නිතර කියලා තියෙනවා මේ YouTube channel එකෙත් ශ්‍රමයෙන් පමණයි අපිට ගොඩ එන්න පුළුවන්. අපි ශ්‍රමය කියන්නේ මොකක්ද? අපිට සියල්ලට වැඩ කරන්න තියෙනවා. අපිට දැනටමත් තියෙනවා රජයේ නිවාඩු 26ක් වර්ෂයකට. මොකටද 26ක් ඕනේ? වෙන කිසිම රටකට නැහැ. ඉතින් අපි දැනගන්න ඕනේ මේ නිවාඩු ප්‍රමාණය අඩු කරලා අපි වැඩ කරන වෙලාව වැඩි කරලා දැන් අපිට කොහොමවත් වැඩට යන්නවත් බෑ ඉන්ධන නැතුව. ඉතින් මේකෙන් ගොඩ එනකොට අපි මතක තියාගන්න ඕනේ එහෙමයි අපි ගොඩ එන්නේ කියලා. සාර්ථකව සංවර්ධන වෙලා තියෙන රටවල් සිංගප්පූරුව වැනි රටවල් ශ්‍රමයෙන් පමණයි මතුවනේ. ඒගොල්ලන්ට වෙන ක්‍රමයක් තිබුණේ නැහැ. ඉතින් වැඩ කරන්න සූදානම් වෙන්න තරුණයනි මේකයි මම ඔබෙන් ඉල්ලා සිටින්නේ.
Thank you very much, sir. So with that, we conclude the Q&A session of this event. From the beginning up until now, all of you have been first-hand witnesses of hearing the life story and listening to the experiences of this humble naturalist that surely can add much to your life in making a huge difference as well as in making yourselves nature lovers. Dear sir, in appreciating your dedication and countless effort in making this world a better place, words are not enough. However, in truly appreciating your achievement and for taking your valuable time to join us today, we'd like to present this small token of appreciating a drawing made by one of the members of WhatsApp, Srini Rupa Sinha. However, as we cannot hand this over to you physically right now, let's look at the wonderful portrait done by Srini.
Wow. Thank you, Srini. That's so kind of you. That's fantastic. My wife will be very jealous that we don't have one of her now.
So we'll hand it over as soon as possible physically. If we can, we'll do it by her. Yes, of course. Sir.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Okay.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Srini, for that amazing portrait. Okay. Moving towards the end of today's event, I would like to invite the Secretary of BOTSOC, Ms. Tapti Rupasinghe, to the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Ayushma. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Good evening, all of you. I'm Tapti Rupasinghe, Secretary of Botanical Society, University of Colombo. It is a great pleasure for me to deliver the vote of thanks at this webinar, The Making of a Legacy. On behalf of the Board of Officials, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our guest speaker, Dr. Rohan Pethiyagoda, for his valuable time, the knowledge, experiences that he shared with us. We are extremely privileged to have you here today, sir. I think our audience got the maximum benefit from today's webinar. Once again, thank you, sir, for being the resource person of today's webinar session. And also, I would like to thank moderator of the session, Senior Professor Devaka Weerakoon, for his support and guidance. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Senior Professor Upul Sonnadara, Dean of the Faculty of Science, Senior Professor Preeti Udagama, Head of the Department of Zoology and Environment Sciences, Dr. Hashindra Katriarachi, Head of the Department of Plant Sciences, academic and non-academic staff members of both departments. This session would not have been possible without the effort of Dr. Inoka Pereira, Senior Treasurer of BEAS, Dr. Anushka Vikramasuriya, Senior Treasurer of BOTSOC, and Dr. Hiran Jayavira, Advisor of Host Media, and Executive Committee members and all the members of BEAS, BOTSOC, and Host Media. So I would like to thank them all. Finally, I would like to thank all the university students from University of Colombo and other universities and all the participants who attended today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Ashma, Srini, Tapti, and everyone at Bees and Devaka. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rohan.
Thank you very much, sir. So with that, we have reached the end of this memorable talk. Even though the past cannot be changed, the golden advice and the inspiration that we received today from Mr. Rohan Pethiyagoda will drive us to make a better world tomorrow. We hope the making of a legacy truly inspired you to become another legacy of true nature lover. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us to witness this lovely evening. And with that, I conclude today's webinar. Stay safe and courageous during these troublesome times. As always, never to forget, protect nature. Even the smallest efforts matter. Have a nice day.